is that Philby has been put forward by both the British and the Russians as a kind of lightning rod, as the sort of the star, when in fact I think one can make a case for saying that he was not the biggest star. I mean, he had this extraordinary period of being in Washington and fooling the Americans, and as Brits we always love someone who fools Americans,
Right.
because that's part of our own cultural insecurity. But really his career was not as stellar, certainly not as stellar as Blunt's.
You're listening to the Spy Masters podcast, and I'm Paul Burke, your host. Follow and subscribe with your favourite podcast provider for all things spy, fact and fiction. And today's topic is Anthony Blunt, because I'm talking to author Piers Blofeld, and his debut book is about Anthony Blunt. It's called Master of Lies. And during our chat, Blofeld explains why he feels Blunt is perhaps the most important of the Cambridge Five. Of course, this discussion comes hot on the heels of my discussion with Antonia Senior about her book, Stalin's Apostles. About the Cambridge Five, of course. So this is an endlessly fascinating topic, and Blofeld's book is very different from that of Antonia Senior. And so I've run the two together, because I think they do complement each other. So let's chat with Piers Blofeld about Anthony Blunt. Master of Lies. Hello and welcome to Spy Masters, Piers.
Hello, Paul. Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Now, we're going to be talking an awful lot about your book, Master of Lies, and that's your biography of Anthony Blunt. But let me just start with this. You've been a literary agent for a number of years, so you've been in the business a long time. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I used to be a publisher, and then eventually there was a week where I had two agencies approach me and suggest that I should cross the road to the shady side of the street, and I did, and I've never really looked back. But I think really, as far as this book's concerned, there's a realization that I've spent my life either as an editor or as an agent reading between the lines and trying to see the story that was intended behind people's words and bring it to the fore more. And I think that's helped me in my analysis of spy stories and the story of Anthony Blunt's life as a spy.
So you always had an interest in the spy world anyway?
Well, to some extent. I mean, I've represented and published various people in that world, but I wouldn't have said that it was something that was a huge part of my life until really quite recently, when I was working on a client's book, or rather, he was doing a book about the betrayal of Operation Market Garden by a Dutch resistance fighter. And I joked to him that there was bound to be a Cambridge spy who was going to pop up in the story.
Right.
And they did, or Anthony Blunt did, in an unexpected way, and a much bigger way than we'd anticipated. And working on that with him, because it was very late in the writing of the book, so he was due to deliver, and it was very tight deadlines. That fed my fascination, and I suddenly thought, well, actually, I'm good at this, and I enjoy it, and there's a story to tell.
So you felt well armed to take it on. How long did it take you then?
Good. I mean, from the moment I really started writing, a couple of years. I mean, proposals take a long time because you have to beat them into shape. Even though so I spent quite a long time being told to repolish by my own agent. But I would say 2 years.
Right. 2 years solid work, yeah. And so this is your debut.
Yes.
Did you kind of think that you would publish a book?
Yes, indeed. I mean, you could argue that my entire career has been the career of a man too lazy to write his own books, and I endlessly tried to get other people to write them for me. And eventually, I've been forced to do it myself. So, yeah, no, I think it was very much on the cards. I did have a very strong sense that I discovered something that I'm good at. I mean, I knew that I was quite good. I've found writing easy. Writing comes fairly easily to me, and I can write copy easily and all that kind of stuff. But that this was something that I could do and I could do well. So it was. I'd run out of excuses not to do it anymore.
Right. And you, of course, you just said before we got on air, you've been to a literary festival just recently. What's the experience like then? Because now you're just about to publish your own book. Slightly different, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. Well, I mean, to be honest with you, as an agent, I've always rather avoided literary festivals because I get to hear writers talk about writing all
Right.
the time. So the fascination, I'm afraid, isn't that great for me. But so but it was terrific to be the other side of the stage, so to speak, and of course, it really does make a difference. Some writers are much better at talking about their books than others, and some subjects are more fascinating than others.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's talk about the book then. Master of Lies, The Life of Anthony Blunt. I will start with something general that's always been something, I suppose, that we can all kind of think about, and that's that Burgess and MacLean, and particularly Philby, are the focus of supposedly the story of the Cambridge Five.
Mm.
So, just in general terms, where does sort of Philby fit into that picture for you?
Well, I think that Philby has become, for all sorts of reasons, he's put himself forward. I mean, he's the only one that wrote his own autobiography.
Right.
He also gave Philip Knightley 150 hours of interviews. Again, the only one that did anything like that. Philby valued being a spy and valued the kind of the kudos that came with being a spy in a way that none of the others did. I mean, Burgess perhaps, but in a much more messy way, and he died young. I also think that, and it's one of the things that I explore in the book, but I'm going to, I think, explore further in possibly my next book.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll get to that at some point.
Which is because I think Philby is that Philby has been put forward by both the British and as a kind of lightning rod, as the sort of the star, when in fact I think one can make a case for saying that he was the most not the biggest star. I mean, he had this extraordinary period of being in Washington and fooling the Americans, and as Brits we always love someone who fools Americans,
right,
because that's part of our own cultural insecurity. But really, his career was not as stellar, certainly not as stellar as Blunt's, or indeed as Maclean's or as Cairncross's. So he wasn't the greatest of them. And I think that he's been put forward for really to cover up Blunt's crimes, I would say.
Okay, right. Well, we'll get into that when we start talking about Blunt, because you did say as we started, that you found out quite surprising things about Operation Market Garden and his role in that, and it was deeper than had first been supposed. But let's go right back to the beginning then. He's older than the others. He was at Cambridge before the others. Sort of set the scene for us there with this young man arriving at Cambridge.
Well, Blunt arrives, he's a scholarship boy from a well-connected but decidedly poor family. I mean, one of the points, everyone talks about how posh they were, but Blunt, he arrived, he will have had, 2 jackets and 3 pairs of trousers. And
Right.
the clothes he wore in the day, he would have had to wear to the drinks party he might have gone to in the evening, whereas the wealthier students would have had black tie to get into. And those kinds of insecurities and I think cut quite deeply at that age. He also arrived having had he had a rather extraordinary school career, and he had this feud with his art master. His interest in art had developed from a childhood spent in Paris with his older brother, and they'd gone during the First World War. They'd bicycled around Paris looking at buildings and art. And so Blunt had developed his interest in art early and feuded with the art master at Marlborough and ended up publicly humiliating him which was a great coup for Blunt at the school because
Mm.
a pupil besting a master is
Oh
always
yeah,
big
absolutely.
deal. But in fact, it was very cruel of Blunt, and the glory of that, he was also best friends with Louis MacNeice,
Mm.
who was in his year at Marlborough, and so he was part of this glamorous double act, and he bested a master, and that I think he had a final summer at Marlborough, which was arguably the only time in his life that he was ever truly happy. And he then set out trying to recreate that dynamic at Cambridge and eventually found a friendship with Guy Burgess that sort of mirrored his friendship with MacNeice. And instead of feuding with an art master, he set about feuding with John Maynard Keynes, who
Mm.
was a rather more significant figure, who actually saw him off. And again, that's one of the great what ifs. He inveigled himself into the Bloomsbury group, and they never thought very highly of him because Blunt was never really, as an intellectual, a very original or creative
No,
thinker.
it was one of his rejections, wasn't it?
Yeah, and if he hadn't been rejected by Bloomsbury, he may never have gone on to be the destructive spy that he became.
Yeah, it's curious because I mean, you still think about that in the context of him being a great art expert, a first class art expert, and how that career developed. And wondering about, wasn't that enough? There's a line you could go there.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think Blunt did quite explicitly. It's a point made very well by Cairncross in his autobiography, but also by others that Blunt liked to see himself as a Renaissance man,
Mm.
as someone who was an intellectual of the purest sort, but was also capable of operating in the world of affairs and of power and of politics, and that he could cross those boundaries and move between those worlds with impunity. And indeed, the story of Blunt really is of a man who felt he was able to move between worlds seamlessly, whether it's cottaging on Lamb's Conduit Street,
Right.
or teaching students, or going to the palace, or meeting Russian handlers in dingy pubs.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's look at that early period then. We're talking about the period when the you had the two ideologies. This early 30s. You've got communism, you've got Nazism. It's the backdrop to what's going on in Cambridge. Give us a little sense of what is going on in Cambridge, and I think we're clearer about the recruitment of the others: Philby, Burgess, then Maclean. But tell us about Blunt.
Well, yes, I mean we are supposedly clear about the recruitment of the others.
Mm.
I don't. The story does come to us from highly suspect sources, and all the people involved died very shortly after they recruited them, or they defected, or they disappeared. I mean,
Right.
the story we think we know, I think we should treat with a considerable pinch of salt. There was the point. I think the key thing to remember is that there was the Great Depression in 1929.
Hmm.
And this was 10 years after, a little more than 10 years after the Russian Revolution. There was this great fight between capitalism and communism. Capitalism looked like it was failing. The solution on the right was therefore fascism, and therefore communism was the only answer to fascism. And so, if you were a young student, and it's quite similar, I think, in some ways to the situation today, there was, if you were a fashionable young student anyway, you simply had to be on the left.
Right.
It was mandatory. It was socially essential, I think, and but also I think people genuinely felt that the old way of doing things was coming to an end, and that there would be this wonderful utopian communist
So you
new
could have a
world.
better world.
Yeah, and gradually over the course of the 30s, Stalin disabused
Right.
everyone of this notion as it became clear that he was a monster, and that it was all very well wishing away all these terrible practices of the past, but the realities of human psychology remain, and people do abuse power if they have power. And so the purges happened, the Spanish Civil War happened, and of course at the end of the 30s you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where Russia and Stalin made peace with Hitler and positively invited Hitler to attack the West, which he did.
So there's an awful lot to dig into there. Let's start with one thing, though, just to go back. What do we know of Blunt's recruitment?
Oh, sorry, yes. Well, the very little is the answer. It's where in the KGB files that have come to us, there are quite detailed accounts of Philbys and Burgesses and Macleans. There is a remarkable absence. Blunt was friends with someone called Alistair Watson, for instance, who was a fellow apostle at Cambridge, with Blunt, and he was certainly closely involved with people who were communists from 1930 onwards, which is several years. He was supposedly recruited in 1937. I don't believe that for a second. For me, the important friendship, he became art critic for The Spectator in 1932, I think, and he started writing Marxist art criticism from a fairly early stage. And he became friends with two Hungarians, one called Frigyes Antal and another called Peter Perry. Peter Perry is his anglicized name, who was an artist. And those two, it would seem, did bring him in some way, whether he was as an agent of the Comintern. And the reason we can say that with some certainty is because a key part of Blunt's access or getting into MI5 was as a result of the fact that Peter Perry's wife was a very good friend of the deputy head of MI5's wife, Guy Liddell. And so you can trace Blunt's movement towards MI5 from 1934. And if that's the case, he then has to have been intending, he has to be intending to do that.
There has to be a reason.
Yeah. And so he has to have been, in some sense, part of the Russian Secret Service setup. But how or why or what, is very, very murky. He was pathologically secretive. Unlike Philby, he gave almost nothing away.
Right, yes. And so that leads us to two issues that crop up out of that. One is the Ukrainian famine and the state of Russia. We know that they knew what was going on. So I suppose my question in a sense is, do they almost then have no fig leaf? This thing about whether you're in it for the ideology, whether you believe in a better world, the reality wasn't that. So were they aware that this was the reality? Is that perhaps not mitigation any longer, if you like?
Yes, I think that one of the questions that my partner sort of asked me is was Blunt a psychopath? And to which the sort of easy answer is yes. But really he saw himself as someone who lived by the mind, and if the mind made a decision in that the emotions quailed at the consequences of that decision, it was up to the mind to force the emotions to get in line. And I think that relates to the question you've just answered, in that I think and this is one of the things that Stalin clearly understood, is that the vast majority of people, then as now, who young people who believe in left-wing ideology, they do so in a let's sit up late at night, setting the world to rights, wishy-washy sort of a way. And frankly, when it comes to being revolutionaries, they're not really of much use to anyone. You're much, much better off with a very small group of people who fully understand that if it's going to happen, you have to be prepared to do whatever is necessary. And those people, of whom Blunt, Burgess, and Philby, and indeed Maclean, were definitely part of that group, they were not dismayed by the famines. They were not dismayed by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I mean, I think it was hard to follow the twists and turns of Stalin, but essentially they knew that there was going to be a great deal of blood shed, and frankly, they were perfectly happy for that to be the case, provided they were not the ones having their blood shed.
Yeah, right. Not actually in the field at the time, no. Another thing about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is that then that forced a lot of people to rethink where they were coming from and try and re-explain the situation. But that aside, my concern about it is that at that time, the Soviets withdrew quite a lot of the support in the UK from the spies. And it essentially, these guys could have then stopped being spies, but wound up actually working really hard themselves in order to maintain that link to the Soviet Union. Is that a fair sort of way of looking at it?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I also do think, and this is where it goes back to the Antal Perry thing, I think that there were other networks of which we are completely unaware.
Right, yes. That's a good point, yes.
And so I don't think that they were, and we now know, for instance, that they were certainly passing a fair amount of information via British Communist Party headquarters.
Right.
So they weren't as alone as all that. But yes, it was certainly a problem for the Russians that because it actually contradicted all their rules of conspiratio, or whatever they call it, that they knew each other and they knew of each other, and that they collaborated. And this was not how the NKVD, as it was then, thought things should be done.
No, right.
And that caused, during the war, considerable consternation, because they didn't trust them, and really I don't think they ever fully trusted them, because not only did they know each other, but they were always suspect for their bourgeois intellectualism.
Well, it is something you bring up in the book, and it's a fair point. I mean, Stalin was always seen as a paranoid character who needed at least two sources, and even then wasn't clear if he'd actually trust it. And that does go back to the point where the possibility of these guys might actually be British spies all along. And there was that concern in Moscow, wasn't there?
There was that concern in Moscow, and I think concern famously follows Burgess and Maclean, but also in particular Kim Philby, dogs him for the 25 plus years he spends in Russia. They never fully trusted him, and I would say the reason for that is because Blunt, again, he fooled the Russians, and although I think they possibly may have pieced that together years after the event, for years they didn't understand what had happened, and they thought that the British had fooled them.
Yeah. I mean, you make a good point, too, about the number of spies involved. We know about the Cambridge Five. This has become a massive thing, the Cambridge Five. But, of course, there were a lot of others who were very sympathetic to the Russian cause. And the one that gets away with it quite a lot, and this kind of, it's something I think that's due a real revision, but it's the Americans and the American spies, because they they're still hiding from this, I think, effectively. But this, the Russians had infiltrated the Americans as much as they infiltrated the British.
A few people remember Alger Hiss, but Alger Hiss was a very, very senior figure within the Roosevelt administration, and he had access to devastating intelligence, and he wasn't alone. No, I mean there were very, very significant. I think the big difference is that the Americans were pretty ruthless about rooting it out. And of course, we now know that as McCarthyism, and of course aspects of McCarthyism were horrendous. But we were, felt that it was horrific. That was a road we couldn't go down. But I'm afraid that the result of that was that we allowed, and I mean, goodness knows how many, but I mean, Antonia Senior in her recent book has identified 22, I believe. And I suspect the number is higher than that. So there were dozens of very senior figures in the civil service and in the British, absolutely at the heart of the British state, who had been traitors and who then went on to be agents of influence and have extremely successful and powerful careers. And that had great power of patronage over the people they then appoint and promote. And I think the ripples of that reach us today.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things about Blunt, isn't it? It's not just about himself, but it's covering for other people as well along the way. That's part of the story. I mean, and you did point out as well in the book about Bill Donovan, who ran the OSS for the Americans during the Second World War, knowing full well that he had communists in his organization, but actually they were useful people and he wanted to use them.
Well, and it's one of the key things about the beginning of the war is that, yes, the evils of Nazism were so overwhelming that people simply wanted people who were prepared to fight them. It didn't really matter what you believed. And also, of course, when it came to intelligence matters, if you were going to exclude every person who could speak a foreign language who was also a bit to the left politically,
of course,
you wouldn't have had anyone who could speak any foreign languages at all, pretty much. So it was, and you also knew that by virtue of being of the left, they did genuinely hate Nazism. So you were inclined to recruit them.
Yeah, no, and it does. It makes perfect sense. And it's easy to look back with hindsight and say they should have spotted this, or maybe that could have been done differently. But as I say, that's entirely with hindsight. Let's talk a little bit about Blunt then. He joins MI5. Tell us about that. And then this is your contention. This is the huge part of the book is about Blunt and his role during the Second War, because this is the central contention of the book about the importance of Blunt as a spy. And
yes,
this war period.
So I think there are kind of, in terms of how Blunt joined, I think one of the myths is that there was an inadequate vetting process. And in fact, Blunt had joined the army in 1939 and he'd been put forward for a security course, which he got yanked from after a few days because there was a red flag which popped up on his file because he had made a trip to Russia in 1935.
Right.
And this he will have known about. It would have been absolutely clear that if you went to Russia, that would mean that an MI5 file would be opened on you.
Right. Yes.
And you could only do so officially through the Intourist thing. So there was no question that he knew about that. And he was able to persuade the brigadier in military intelligence who interviewed him about this stuff that he'd only gone as an art historian because he had his copious, and you can see them at the Courtauld to this day, notes that he had taken on all sorts of Poussins that the Russians had. But furthermore, the brigadier was friendly with a man called Dennis Proctor, who is one of these spies that Blunt protected, who was then a rising star at the Treasury as a civil servant, already being tipped as a future cabinet secretary, and the absolute epitome of establishment respectability. And Dennis Proctor, of course, vouched for Blunt, and so Blunt was reinstated on this security course. This is important because when he, only a few months later, gets pushed forward by his friend Victor Rothschild as someone who should join MI5, Guy Liddell that is then all in the file. So he knows all about this, and he knows that there's been a bit of a flag, but it's all been explained away, and he can follow exactly the same chain of reasoning. But Blunt had two other important sort of elements to this process. So he was being vouched for by Victor Rothschild, the third Baron Rothschild, a peer of the realm, which is quite impressive. He was a very good friend of a woman called Tess Mayer, who went on to become Victor Rothschild's second wife. Tess Mayer was a childhood friend of Guy Liddell and was a universally liked and popular young woman. And so Blunt was to some extent a friend of the family. And furthermore, Guy Liddell's number two, Dick White, was also friends with Dennis Proctor. And so White was able to go to Proctor again, and Proctor was once again able to vouch
Yeah.
for
So essentially, when
Blunt.
it actually came to talking to people, everybody said, "Yeah, he's a decent guy. He's a good
He's a
guy."
decent guy. So but you've had a peer of the realm, a
Mm.
family friend, and a senior civil servant.
Yeah.
That, by the standards of the day, is very
It's
effective
vetting.
vetting.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It would fool. I think it would fool. It's tougher standards than Peter Mandelson's had.
Mm. Yeah.
But let's not go down that road.
No, perhaps
And
not.
and that's it's also very significant because he very much joins MI5 as I say, as a friend of the family. Little, who is really the dominant figure. He's not the Director General, but he's the Deputy Director General, and he is in charge of B Division, which is the counterintelligence division, and he is the most significant figure within MI5. Really, he's on an operational daily basis,
Right.
and he is aware of Blunt from the very beginning. He's also a highly cultivated man, and Blunt's first book, Artistic Theory, comes out in August, so 3 months after he's joined, which absolutely seals this idea of him as this donnish charmer who's full of erudition and delightful intelligence and is not to be mistrusted in any way. And so Little then takes him on as his own assistant, and within a few months of joining, Blunt is given the responsibility of writing a new handbook for what MI5 called the Watchers, their surveillance teams, so that he's in charge of the operational details of how MI5 conducts surveillance. And this he does an excellent job of. He is involved in various cases. He has a connection with Czech intelligence, which gives him all sorts of connections which prove important later in the war. Mm-hmm. And as a result, within a year of joining, by the spring of 1941, late spring of 1941, he has been asked to set up this operation called Triplex, which is spying on all diplomats in the UK. And this is an extraordinary operation. It covers every single embassy, but also all the ports of entry, the two airports that were still running, one flying a flight to Sweden, the other one flying a flight to Portugal, which were both neutral countries. And so Blunt was breaking into diplomatic pouches and stealing messages. He was bugging embassies. He was running agents. He had an extraordinary... He
couldn't have asked for a better job, in other words, to actually do what he needed to do.
Yeah, no, quite incredible. And the thing is, he never once put a foot wrong. And so, because of this absolutely immaculate way he had of handling things, and the other thing about this is that then gave him access at very senior levels to the Foreign Office, because they obviously had a great deal of interest in what neutral and allied diplomats were getting up to. So that gave him a strong route into the corridors of power at Whitehall. And then a few months, well, nearly just under a year after that, Churchill gets asked whether he'd like to have briefings on what MI5 are up to. And he says, yes, that would be great, thank you. And so the person that MI5 asked to do that is none other than Anthony Blunt.
Right.
So suddenly he is writing Churchill's twice weekly security briefings. And this gives him carte blanche to access absolutely anything that MI5 are up to. Because he can simply say, oh, well, the Prime Minister wants to know, and no one's going to gainsay that. And not only that, it means that he is now effectively whispering in Churchill's ear. And he knows exactly what intelligence Churchill has. So he's able to pass across. When Churchill is negotiating with Stalin, he's able to tell Stalin what aces Churchill thinks he has up his sleeves. So it's a position of incredible power. then, as a sort of result of that, and as a result of various other things, he also gets appointed to be the liaison between MI5 and MI6. And that's a slightly more complicated picture. I won't go into any details about that.
Right,
But
yes.
that gives him
But it's in the book, and we should
further range and access into the full range of British intelligence activities everywhere in the world. So he really has an absolutely phenomenal degree of access, which, to go back to your early point about Philby was, for the last 2 years of the war, and most of the end of the rest of the war, he was head of station for the Iberian section.
Yeah.
What he knew was a tiny fraction of what Blunt knew.
Yeah, and a lot of the intelligence that Philby was passing was sketchy because a lot of it was stuff that he was getting sort of secondhand.
Yes, exactly.
Directly.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, we can see from that the absolute power of the position that Blunt has, and the importance of the intelligence coming across his desk. And there's a phrase you use in the book, which is that blood-soaked, essentially, that he has this guilt.
Yes, I think because I think the kind of one of the key things about so much of the literature on the Cambridge spies is that there are two types of intelligence. There's the sort of the slightly overrated element of you sort of break into your enemy's base and you steal the blueprints for Project X,
right,
and you bring them back and you go, haha, we know the secret to Project X. And that thing of just simply handing over information is actually quite limited. But all the books about Blunt, with one or two, one actual exception in the past, tend to focus on this aspect of it. And often they cite, they handed over this many thousand documents. But for the British, our crown jewels of our intelligence war were our deception operations. The D-Day deception plans, or Operation Mincemeat, the man who never was. These are the things that we think of as being fooling the enemy into thinking something that is false is much more powerful than stealing the enemy's secrets. And yet, that's a question we've never asked about the Cambridge spies. And I'm afraid the truth is, and this is where Blunt was uniquely placed to perform this task, that the real damage of the Cambridge spies comes from the fact that they were deceiving the British. And this is where this particular story of Agent Josephine, who was ostensibly a high-level Nazi agent operating from the heart of the British war effort, and who was being investigated at the end of the war, after the war ended, by none other than Anthony Blunt. And so you have this bizarre situation where you have a high-level penetration agent at the heart of the Allied war effort being investigated by a high-level penetration agent at the heart of the Allied war effort. But the assumption somehow is, well, but Blunt was a Russian spy and Josephine was spying for the Nazis, so they can't be the same person. But in fact, when you start to look at what was being passed over, what Josephine was doing aligns perfectly with Stalin's strategic goals, which was he wanted the second front to open up for he wanted D-Day to happen. But when it comes to Operation Market Garden, if that had succeeded, then the war would have ended 6 months earlier, or there's a very good case to be made.
Yeah, that the Allies would have made ground much quicker.
And Stalin would have still been in Ukraine. There would have been no Eastern Bloc. There would have been no Berlin Wall. The Cold War may never have happened. And so seen in that light, and I don't want to overemphasize simply the Arnhem thing, because there were other things that were being done.
Yeah, of course. And
he was doing everything he could to slow down the Western Allies' advance. Blunt is absolutely steeped in blood, because the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who were shipped off to the gulags, the million German women who were raped by Russian soldiers at the end of the war, the famine that followed Market Garden, which killed 30,000 Dutch people. The list really does go on. And again, that puts him, because Maclean handed over incredible secrets, but that's all he did. Blunt can be accused of killing a few dozen Albanian and Georgian agents who were being sent in, but they were kind of in the game. Blunt kills innocent civilians. I mean, there is a strong case to be made that he was handing over bombing targets in Britain during the Blitz.
Yeah, I mean, it's a phenomenal picture. Of course, the thing about it is that you said he's got Churchill's ear, so he can bend Churchill's ear, and Stalin is getting the information that he's giving him. And of course, that all goes to the shape of the world that we found in 1945 when we come up against the Cold War. It's all down to, well, during the negotiations that happened during the war and what followed shortly after the war, is knowing what you know. And Stalin knows what everybody else knows, essentially.
Yes, indeed. And he's been fighting this battle. And the thing is, we were warned. There was a chap called Walter Krivitsky who defected rather than go back to Russia and be purged. He defected in 1937, and he was absolutely explicit that Stalin had been preparing. Stalin always saw Imperial Britain and capitalist America as the great enemies. He wasn't really, he wasn't so concerned about Nazi Germany, and because I think there was a very good chance that Hitler was always going to lose, and he was always a bit too much of a loose cannon, and that war was never going to be won. And so he was fighting the Cold War from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Right.
We started fighting the Cold War, I don't know, from the Berlin airlift. I mean, so there's a 10-year gap, 11-year gap, and Blunt was absolutely crucial to that process.
Right, and I think that's the heart of the book. But of course, there's a bigger story, it's a longer story. It goes on. When Blunt actually comes clean, and we will get to that, he actually claims that he stopped spying at the end of the Second World War. Yes. But he has quite a specific role. Well, he has a very specific role in what happens with Burgess and Maclean. But it's not true, is it? He doesn't stop spying in 1940.
No, and it's one of the things that really has been revealed. There were some new files released at the beginning of last year, a huge tranche of files, and he was invited to rejoin MI5 in 1948. He was heavily involved in the defection, and really one should put inverted commas around that word, of a Russian microbiologist called Borodin, who actually, I think, stole British biological secrets and took them back to Russia. He ran or returned a chap called Wolfgang zu Putlitz, who was a German embassy diplomat, but who had also been a Russian spy. And he returned him. There's an extraordinary scene where they return to the Russian sector in Berlin in 1947. And, you can actually picture Russians sitting, Blunt sitting with his Russian, KGB mentors, having a drink of vodka and some caviar before returning back to the UK. But he also, even more devastating, and this goes on for years. I mean, there's one of his colleagues in MI5 was called Courtney Young, and there's a quote from him in 1956 saying that there was absolutely nothing in this office that Blunt wouldn't have known about, as late as that. So he has, an incredible degree of access, and is still closely involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when it comes to Burgess, well, it happens with Venona, isn't it? That the Americans get onto the idea that there is an agent, and that's Maclean.
Yes, and because the other thing, but at war's end, you have Venona, but you also have there's the Volkov incident, and you have the Guzenko defection. And for someone as intelligent as Blunt, I think that he was absolutely certain that from 1945 onwards, and the reason why he's promoted that story, that the net was closing in and that they were going to get caught. That was inevitable. So it was then a process of crisis management, if you like. And Venona was the sort of the fuse that was just burning inexorably closer and closer and closer, as the Americans gradually decoded this stuff that led them to the certainty that it was Donald Maclean who was a Russian spy in the Washington embassy from 1944 onwards. And Blunt prepared the ground. And I think this is where I opened the book, is that
Yeah.
he decides that the only way he can survive is if the others go. Maclean is doomed anyway. Burgess has become a total liability. He's a drug addict and a drunk, and is going to either get them killed or get them arrested, or both, frankly. And so, but because it's always been one of the puzzles that by the fact that Guy Burgess defected alongside Donald Maclean meant that Kim Philby had his career ended. And from a Russian perspective, this was a disaster because they spent years getting Philby in a position where he was in, a state of great authority in MI6, and he with Burgess going, he was doomed. And so I think it's pretty clear that it was Blunt who persuaded Burgess to go, and by doing so, he then ensured that Maclean was gone, Burgess was gone, Philby was gone, and he made sure there were documents that implicated Cairncross in Burgess's flat when it was searched. So that was it. That was then the five were spoken for. He was alone, able to do a deal, because the one thing the British could not really allow to happen was for it to be revealed that the penetration by the Russians had been as severe as it actually was.
Right.
And so he was able to continue to lead a charmed life, which he did.
So, yeah, I mean, he did. For still Surveyor of the Queen's pictures, nobody bothered to tell the Queen after he'd made his confession in 1964, which, of course, followed the defection of Philby in 1963. But at that point, he comes clean, or he certainly confesses. He does not come clean. That's the wrong way to put it. But he does make a confession.
He makes a limited confession, yeah.
And then you have the questions about, well, if that's the case, then why wasn't he banged up? And that goes to why you think the British colluded, essentially, in keeping it quiet because of the devastating nature of this. Maybe to do with the relationship with America, too?
Oh, I certainly think, yeah, it would have, if it had been known that a senior figure within British intelligence had been responsible. I mean, I think there were 16,000 casualties for Operation Market Garden, a great many of them Americans. If it had been known that someone like Blunt had been responsible for the death of thousands, possibly tens of thousands, if you do all the leaks he did, of American GIs, so soon after the war. I mean, we're talking, it's less than 10 years ago. So, it would have, I think, caused an immense rift within NATO. It would have damaged the special relationship irreparably, probably. And it might well have destroyed MI5 and MI6. They might have needed to be kind of completely reformed. I think you can argue that might have been a better thing. I'm not sure that the special relationship has ever done us much good. And I certainly think that the fact that the British Secret Services got used to the idea of lying to the head of state and to prime ministers successively, which they did. I mean, they very clearly lied to Margaret Thatcher in 1979 when she outed Blunt. They were only telling her a very small part of the truth they knew. And that habit is a very bad habit to get into. And I'm afraid I think it's a habit we are still very much in, and we could really do with shaking. I don't think it does the Secret Services any good, and it certainly doesn't do us as a civic society any good.
No, well, it's of course only in recent decades you've actually had any laws or rules to do with the Secret Service in any case, isn't it?
No, I mean, our secrecy laws are a joke, frankly. I mean, they can decide what is secret and what isn't secret. We have supposed freedom of information, but there are so many exceptions, and they can simply go, there's an exception. And there's no way of knowing if there is an exception.
No, I mean, in general terms, talking about the book, there are two things. One that always strikes me is that MI6 just keeps its records hidden.
Yeah.
and it was opened up one time for an official history, and after that, the records were closed again. But also that there are files that you mentioned related to Blunt that are still, that I'm sure you'd like to see that you can't access
Oh,
through
absolutely. I
MI5.
mean, but it goes there. There is. I mean, I think the most ridiculous example I came across was there is a file of letters from Victor Rothschild to Lord Cherwell, who was Churchill's chief scientific
Yeah,
advisor,
right.
in 1941, and mostly these are letters. Victor Rothschild not obeying the chain of command, and being a rather self-entitled prick as he was,
Yeah,
frankly, if you can forgive the use of language. But he and they're brief letters, but half of them are still classified. And you're thinking, well, what on earth could Victor Rothschild have been writing in 1941 that still deserves to be kept secret, other than
yeah,
the fact
absolutely.
that it makes him out to look like a fool? Um, there's really nothing there, and so I put in a freedom of information request, and it was denied months and months later. But simply to see, to test, and that is truly ridiculous.
Yeah, no, I see where you're coming from. But there was a release of files in early 25, wasn't there? And that provided a lot more information, yeah?
It provided thousands, I think about 5,000 pages
Right,
of. I mean, there are glimpses. I should think I got about a dozen
right,
little
okay.
snippets from
Mm.
that were really useful, that slipped through. But the vast majority was said nothing new. And I think it's very easy. But there are huge quantities of files. You can drown research. The best place to hide a needle is in a haystack, and
Yes, of
and
course,
then
yeah.
you simply drown researchers in honey. You just give them
Yeah.
extra files to look at,
No, I do
and
remember
and
that's a
their eyes
CIA
start to
policy,
spin.
isn't it?
Yeah,
That they release millions of documents at the
yeah,
same time, and then it's impossible to
yeah.
find what you need in the middle of it all, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't. I mean, so there was this great release, and there's a sort of great belief that somehow that's them being open, but it isn't. And I mean, very bluntly, I mean, there is as much, if not more, information that has emerged from Russian files
Right, yes.
than has emerged from British files. We
Which is
are, which is not great, really.
if you don't appreciate the irony of that, you're not really paying attention, are you?
Yeah.
So he was exposed in 79. It's to do, and again, this is all in the book, but it's about Andrew Boyle's book, The Climate of Treason, and
Yes.
Margaret Thatcher then denouncing him. What kind of time did he have? I mean, he didn't live very long after that. He lived until 1983. But,
I yeah.
you said a psychopath was something you mentioned early on and say how easy it is to say that. But when we see the way that Burgess fell apart, the way that McLean fell apart, the unhappiness certainly of those characters, Blunt seems much more calm about everything.
Yes, I mean, I think he was a. I mean, he was a heavy drinker, and I think there are all sorts of pressures inside him. But to be honest with you, I think he rather enjoyed being outed. It gave him a chance to give a little bow at the end of his life.
Mm,
He'd been a sick man for a few years. I mean, he started 1979 by co-curating with Debo, the Duchess of Devonshire, at the Royal Academy, an exhibition called The Treasures of Chatsworth.
hmm
And one can sort of picture him and the Duchess and the Duke rootling around in the attics of Chatsworth, and then going down and having a nice kitchen supper with a couple of decent bottles of claret.
Right.
And you think, well, that's quite nice. I'd quite like to do that, actually. I mean, that sounds like fun. I bet the attics of Chatsworth are well worth a rootle around in.
Yeah.
And once he was outed, he still had a host of very well-to-do friends who are extremely happy to have Anthony come and stay for the weekend. He was. I don't really think it caused him any suffering at all.
No, right.
Frankly, I mean, so, and he didn't live long. I mean, he died in 1983, and and one can say that he did sort of drink himself to death, and they
Mm.
were all alcoholics. But that's sort of wider
not
psychological
related
aspect.
to the actual to what he was doing. That was
Yeah.
just the kind of man he was and the kind of people around him that
Well, exactly.
kind of
Yeah.
thing had built up. Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, that's like it's more frivolous question, really. But the spy stuff that we had in Britain beginning in the early '60s, the realist spy stuff, the Le Carre, Dayton, and the stuff that followed on from that for decades, related to the Cold War. How influential do you think that this particular story is on that?
Oh, I think hugely. I think Le Carre in particular. I mean, I think it's one of the things that I find fascinating that the story of the Cambridge Spies is sort of bookended by you have the film The Third Man, which comes out. It's number one in America as Philby arrives in America,
Right.
And it is to some degree based on him or has because Green was a friend of his during the war,
Right.
and knew about his exploits in Vienna in 1934, and then Margaret Thatcher's denunciation of Anthony Blunt comes 3 weeks, I think, after the final airing of the wonderful Alec Guinness adaptation of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
Yeah.
So you have this extraordinary way in which life and art mirror each other. And I certainly think that Le Carre, that the Tinker Tailor Smiley Carla books tread very heavily on the Cambridge Spies. And indeed, this goes back to one of the ways in which Philby has been sort of promoted within the group, over promoted as the great spy, is that I think for various reasons, partly because it's what MI5 and MI6 wanted. They wanted attention taken away from Blunt. I also think that probably Le Carre felt that a gay antagonist was probably not acceptable. So Bill Hayden becomes the sort of more heterosexual, Philby-esque figure. And of course, and so you have this, but I think, but you can draw all sorts of parallels between, as I sort of tease out a little bit in the book, between Tinker Tailor and real life. I mean, Smiley is Guy Little, and you can see all sorts of resonances between the characters. And I think that we have allowed ourselves. I mean, one of the things it's done is that, particularly because that TV adaptation is so marvelous and addictive, that it makes us believe that there is and was a lovely avuncular George Smiley figure wiping his glasses and solving the crime,
sorting it out,
and sorting it out, and actually that never happened.
And
that's
really interesting,
yeah.
So you did mention when we started about the next book and what you were sort of leading towards.
Because well, my intention is to do the story of Kim Philby, because I think because whereas Blunt is the great underrated spy, Kim Philby is the imperfect spy, and the myth of Kim Philby and how that myth came about, which is touches on all sorts of elements within Russian plot, plans within the KGB. So there's a whole story to be told there, I think.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll leave it there because obviously that's not fair to ask you more than that. So one last question then, just a recommendation. I don't know, and it doesn't have to be about spies, to be honest. But is there something you've read recently or something that you've come across that you really enjoyed?
Well, I think the thing I would be unfair of me not to mention is there is a man called Professor Anthony Glees, and who wrote a book. Because one of the things I thought while writing this book is okay, I'm jolly clever and everything, but this stuff doesn't seem to be that unobvious. Why? And because everything I kept expecting to discover something that would contradict my theory, but everything I discovered merely amplified my theory, and I wondered why it was that no one else had gone down this road. And it's only since finishing the book that I came across a book published in the early 80s, mid 80s, by Anthony Glees, called The Secrets of the Service,
Right.
which does ask very similar questions to the ones I ask. But that, for various reasons, is a book that has all but disappeared from the awareness. But it is. I didn't know that I owed it a debt, but I do sort of owe it a debt.
Okay, right. Well, I'll put that in the program notes so people can catch up on that, certainly.
Yeah.
Piers, it's been a brilliant time. Thank you very much.
Oh, Paul, I've really enjoyed it. Very nice to talk to you. Thank you for having me.
So, as I said, I have included Anthony Glee's book, Secrets of the Service, in the program notes. But afterwards, when I was speaking to Piers, we chatted for a while, and he actually offered to write an article about Glee's book and his own book for the Aspects of Crime magazine. So that will appear later in the month too. If you are interested in Master of Lies, How Anthony Blunt's Treachery Changed the World, you can get it from all good book outlets. If you click the link on the program notes, you can get it from us. If you've enjoyed the show, please rate and subscribe with your favourite podcast provider. That helps us to keep bringing you these interviews. And I'll be back very shortly with another interview. But in the meantime, bye for now, and thank you very much for listening.